Did we lose Rick again?
Okay, I hope you can hear me.
No, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Really...
So it's 10:10. We got about a good, looks like 20 people on the line. Want to welcome everybody. Again, if you just got on, please put yourself on mute so we can have a as functional call as possible. Just going to, I'm letting everybody know that the call is being recorded and stored on the cloud. We will distribute it out for others of our members and folks who could not join today in this medium, so they can listen and learn. And we'll share that out to folks over in Shreveport as well for you all to do the same. But just real quick, it's a pleasure for us to have Rick with us this morning. We wish it would have been under different circumstances. As you all know, yesterday and today, we were scheduled to do 2 days of activities with Rick here in Jackson, at Tougaloo, and over at our spot at the Balagoon Center, and doing, we were hoping to do an all-day training today that many of you were going to join us from Louisiana. So when things become more healthy, I'm not going to say get back to normal, because I don't think there will be a normal as we understood it again. But when things settle down on the disease front, we're going to try to definitely get Rick back. Hopefully that'll be in the fall, so broader elements of the community can participate. So be on the lookout for that. And just briefly, or just to repeat for those who didn't, who may have came on late and didn't hear, asked Rick to do a 30-minute presentation about what's going on with the economy, why the roller coaster that we're experiencing, and what it's all means, and where and how we can intervene to stop some of the stuff that the Republicans are trying to force down our throats, but also how to respond so that working people can organize themselves to not only survive but change how the economy and society functions. So many of you, I don't think anybody here, Rick, needs much of an introduction. I will say a couple of different things, about the democracy at work and his regular podcasts and videos. Check that out. Many of you, while you are sitting at home, all of us are pretty much working from home now. Check out Rick's Twitter feed and Facebook. I particularly been enjoying Rick's Twitter of late, even though I'm not much of a fan of Twitter. I think he's been burning it up there with just kind of answering some key questions and giving some analysis on the madness around the economic logic that's being employed. That's very helpful. So I would encourage folks to check that out. And from there, Rick, I'll just let you take it over. And again, folks have any questions after the 30 minutes for dialogue, please put them in the chat, and I'll read them off and we'll open it up from there. All right, it's all yours, Rick.
All right, thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm flattered, I'm honored to be asked to do this. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine. I just
Okay.
went on mute. Yeah.
All right, okay. I'm flattered and honored to have been asked to do this. I think you folks in Jackson are leading the way for many in this country. You may not know that, but all kinds of people are intrigued, fascinated, and attracted by the whole idea of an economic development around worker co-ops as an alternative. And as I say, it is something I believe in, so it's a pleasure to be connected, and if I can be useful, that's all that I really could hope for. By way of introduction, 2 little points. 1, I'm using a capitalist system of internet communication. the Comcast Corporation. They went out several times around the country yesterday because, like every other capitalist enterprise, they had not prepared for, had not understood, had no plan for coping with the situation we're in. I hope that doesn't happen as I talk, but if it does, they seem to be able to get them back on track after a few minutes, so let's hope that we can do that as well. The second thing before I jump in is to ask you to bear with me. I'm going to talk in dramatic ways, but it's not in order to be rhetorical. It is in order to give you what I think is the actual situation unfolding. So let me begin. We are pretty quickly approaching a situation that is historic, beyond anything you may have already thought. It's historic because US capitalism, the economic system of the United States, is in now its worst crisis in my lifetime. And I'm over 70 years of age, so we're talking quite a while. And that crisis is getting worse day by day in a kind of relentless process that has historical parallels. This kind of breakdown that I'll go through briefly with you in a minute has in the past often been, not always, but often, the prelude to a kind of general disintegration. Let me give you some of the dimensions. Number one, a system, the United States capitalist system, that has known for at least a century that there are periodic invasions of viruses that are part of nature, part of life, that can be and have been deadly. If you're not familiar with it, the last time we had a really, really bad one was 1918, a century ago. A virus that started in a military base of the United States Army in Kansas. It ended up killing almost 700,000 Americans and millions of people in other countries. It presented the problem of unprepared hospitals, unprepared equipment, unprepared trained people. In short, it presented exactly the same problems that the coronavirus has presented now. Since 1918, we've had all kinds of similar viral outbreaks, some very minor and some very serious. In recent history, we've had at least 3 serious ones: the SARS virus, the MERS virus, and the Ebola virus. So we know in recent past that we face this problem. First point then, the capitalist system of the United States either could not or would not prepare to handle this one. And there is no excuse. I'm going to give you an explanation, but an explanation is not an excuse. Here's the explanation. There is no private profit in producing test kits, ventilators, masks, beds, hospitals, protective gear for healthcare workers. There's no money to be made in producing it and storing it in a warehouse. So private enterprises don't do it, and they don't do it because it isn't profitable. Okay, then the government could step in and compensate from the failure of a private profit system to prepare us for what we know we will sooner or later need. The government could come in and buy it all up and store it, stockpile it. and make sure it keeps its quality and it keeps its capacity in proportion to the kinds of risks we face. The government of this capitalist economy failed to do that. So we have the failure of the private sector driven by profit, and the failure of the public sector driven more or less by the same mentality, which you're going to see replayed over and over again in this story. The mentality that somehow making private profit of the private business the number one priority is some sort of magic route to solving social problems. It never was, and we're seeing an example of how it never was, only it threatens our life, this example. But bear with me, there's more coming. This morning it was announced, that is this morning, Friday, as we're speaking, that the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, under the pressure of oil and gas companies, has relaxed the regulations on air pollution because, they say, of the coronavirus. Air pollution is a major cause of asthma and many other respiratory diseases. If you have those diseases, you are more vulnerable to the coronavirus than if you don't have respiratory diseases. This act, done at the behest of capitalist enterprises in the oil and gas sector, materially increases the danger to the health and welfare of the American people. Capitalist profits drove those requests, the government bent to support them, and we live with the consequences. Then there is President Trump's decision, in my judgment, driven by his anxieties about re-election, to have us all back to work around Easter time in 2 to 3 weeks. Every epidemiologist that I know of, and I've read a lot of them, says that is dangerous. We cannot do that. Getting people back into large groups this soon violates everything we know about the spread of this disease. When he announced that he wants the churches packed, that's Trump's words, on Easter, I noticed that the archbishops in the Roman Catholic Church in at least a dozen major cities, including New York, Philadelphia, Houston, Los Angeles, Chicago, and others, announced that their churches would be closed on Easter because they will not subject their parishes to the dangers of a packed church. Now the punchline, which I will then explain. When you have people threatened in their jobs and incomes, the way you all know has already happened. We had an
Hold tight, everybody. He gave us a little warning about this. So the system for him will probably come back, and then we'll try to get him to start over. He may not even know he's disconnected. So
Okay.
just hold tight.
I'm back. Can you hear me?
Okay, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. I'll keep going.
Okay.
When you have this level of clash between a ruling group, whether it's a king or an emperor or a czar or a prime minister or a president, you name it, if you have this kind of disconnect between what the ruler thinks needs to be done and what a growing mass of people, never 100%, often not even 50%, but a growing mass of people see as unbearable, outrageous and literally a threat to their health and safety, you have the condition for a system breaking down. I believe, and I'm not an alarmist, that we are rapidly approaching that situation. Millions of workers are going to likely have to decide in the weeks ahead whether they will heed the demands of the rulers to go back to work and live with the risks of a disease that can kill you, or tell the ruling class, we will no longer work with you. This system cannot handle what I've just said. It can't handle 30% of the people saying we're out. It surely can't handle any more than that, and it probably can't handle even less than that. Already now, large numbers of workers have in the last 2 weeks fought against employers who pressured them to come to work. These are private resistances. Sometimes those workers get fired, which scares them, of course. Sometimes those employers back off because they don't know quite how to handle this situation. But if you have a million little private moments and they become pulled together by some organization, for example, a labor union, and I gave a speech just yesterday to the painters union in the construction trades. They are now seriously debating, just as one example, what they're going to do if they are told either it's an order of some kind to go back to work or the equivalent threat. You don't give them enough money to survive without going back to work, which then forces them. And there are millions of people in that situation right now that are working only because if they don't, they literally can't make it. And the insulting part of the congressional action taken over the last 2 or 3 days is to imagine that giving every family $1,200 or every taxpayer $1,200 changes this. It gives you an idea of how they are unable, as they thrash around, to cope with this situation. All right, so there we are. We're in a situation of historic breakdown of this system. We have no preparation. Let me stress that again. It's not only no preparation for dealing with this virus, and therefore no excuse. We know why it wasn't profitable to the private sector. And we know why that the government sector is so controlled by the corporations and the private sector that they don't really have an independent mentality. So they couldn't ideologically or any other way compensate for the grotesque failure of the private sector for profit reasons to cope with the pandemic. But it's worse, because if what you do is you stick millions of people into their homes with their families, their kids out of school, and all the rest, there have to be enormous preparations for how to live in a society like that.
Hold tight again, folks. I want to take this opportunity to remind us all to start looking up how to get shortwave radios, particularly battery or solar powered or crank shortwave radios. Reason being, this means of communication is not in our control. and they can cut this off, these cell phones and videos and internet, they can cut this off if they will. The older technology, they can monitor it, but they can't control it the same way. So let's all get prepared to do that as soon as we can. You might have to order it. If you order it, be sure to sanitize whatever comes in the mail as best you can. Sun exposure works, but you have to do it for a while. Some type of disinfectant, because the virus does live on certain types of surfaces for a minute. Rick, you back? Rick, you back? I don't think he's made it back just yet. Zoom must got something against Rick.
Rick and all of us, Kali.
Yeah, he completely, I'm looking at the participant, he completely dropped off.
Yeah.
So let's see, I think he's probably hung up and trying to get back on. All right, there's a 336 number, if you can put yourself on mute.
Yes.
The joys and challenges of technology.
Kali, it's Alan.
Yeah.
Would it work for me to call Rick and have him speak through my phone into my computer to you guys?
It might. Let's give him like another, he said it was like 5 minutes. I think we had a warning. I mean, I just encourage us all to be patient. Hey, Josh, can you go back on mute for a second? So let's hold on for just a quick second, Alan. If it lasts maybe 2 or 3 more minutes, we might want to try that route, but let's give him a quick second.
Okay.
All right, Rick, we got you back?
Yes.
Okay, we were waiting.
Okay. Thank you
We
very
had the
much.
hands up. All right.
I hate having to apologize for a big fat capitalist corporation, Comcast, but that's what I have to do. Okay. I was ending with an image that struck me overnight. A friend of mine from Brooklyn sent me a photo. It's a lineup on a city street in Brooklyn of refrigerated trucks, about 8 of them. They are a temporary morgue. There are so many people dying in New York City that the regular morgue cannot accommodate them. And so these refrigerated trucks are holding the bodies of people already dead from the coronavirus, and also to keep them from the general population, etc. You cannot have a funeral. You cannot have any kind of service. The family can't get near them. I mean, try to think. The level of failure to cope can be given in another way. If you look at countries like France or Germany or Italy, they have many more beds, hospital beds per person than the United States. They have kits, they have all kinds of preparations that the United States did not. Try to remember with me the statements by Donald Trump and the many you've heard about how the American economy is greater than any other. It was only greater in those dimensions that those people wanted us to look at. But if you measure the greatness of an economy with its capacity to care for people that get sick, then the United States is not the greatest. It's not even close. It failed to prepare for this. It failed even as other countries that are capitalist countries as well didn't fail this badly. It's a remarkable statement to the issue that in this country, the government has long been captured by the people at the top. It serves them, and it does not do for the rest of the people, even what other capitalist economies get done, because at least there, while the government prioritizes the business community, it doesn't do it on the scale that's done here. There is a War Powers Act in the United States, passed during the Second World War, which says that the government has the right, so that's the law now, the government has the right to compel corporations to produce nationally required goods and services. In other words, from the time this virus started in December of last year, President Trump had the authority, as he has today, to order the production of ventilators, test kits, masks, beds, hospitals, you name it. He has chosen not to do it. And he has the support of the Republican Party and much of the Democratic Party in not doing it. And when he was asked yesterday why not, he said, well, I'm not going to nationalize our businesses. You see, that's what happened in Venezuela, and they didn't do well. Yeah, but please keep in mind, nationalizing businesses is what the Chinese did, and they have now put this crisis in abeyance. They're way ahead of what is being done here. In Italy, which is a terribly afflicted place, the government in Italy asked the Chinese for help because the Chinese had struggled with this illness, this virus, and made a good program against it. The Chinese government responded immediately, sent airplanes filled with doctors, nurses, and frontline workers who had real experience in fighting the disease, and they've been working with the Italian government ever since. The United States asked the Chinese for nothing. And you can see there the same mentality, Mr. Trump saying he's going to use products made in the United States, which he does not order to be made. General Motors and Ford yesterday, I believe both of them, said they would be willing to produce things, but they're not going to do it unless they get the price that will make it profitable for them. And so they're negotiating. That's costing lives, that negotiation. And the negotiating with the government they put into office, which is worried about how much profit they're going to make. If you ever needed an example of prioritizing profit over people's public health, you're living in it right now. This is a system that has its clear priorities, and those priorities are not yours or mine. Somebody, some social group, some social force really has to step up now and organize and mobilize what tens of millions of Americans are already feeling and seeing, that this is a system that has broken down, failed to prepare adequately for what they could have and should have, is failing now to cope, and is worrying most now about the profits of the people that put them in office rather than the vast majority. That's not a sustainable political situation. You are beginning to hear, and I'm not surprised, the phrase general strike. That is when large groups of working people across different industries, different regions, begin to recognize that they have a common problem. And that problem is a system that works the way ours does. That is, it fails at one of the most elemental obligations of any economic and political system, to safeguard the health and safety of the people living in it. All right, now how did we get to this collapse? We don't have a lot of time, so let me be brief. We can start anywhere, but I'm going to start with the crash of 2008 and 9. The reality is that crash was brought about by a fundamental failure of modern capitalism. And let me describe it to you very simply. Just as it is the obligation of any economic and political system to support, to guarantee as a fundamental obligation, the health and safety of its people, it is also the obligation of every economic system to give the people in it adequate housing. We are creatures who need to have shelter. We need to have a warm, dry place to sleep and to eat and to live our personal lives. Otherwise, physical and mental illness comes like a crash through the door. Everybody knows that. If you're going to have a housing system in which individuals must use money to buy access to housing, either by purchasing a home or renting space in a housing structure, if you're going to do it that way, which capitalism does, then you have to arrange that the money earned by the people is sufficient to purchase the housing needed by the people. A system is successful if it does that, and it is unsuccessful if it fails to do that. What does that mean? It's a failure if the price of housing is too high relative to the income of the people who use their income to access the housing. Likewise, if the income is too low relative to the housing price, then the system has failed. Our system long ago failed to do that, and it papered that failure over by arranging that housing will be given to you only if you borrow money. In other words, we're not going to pay you enough to access a home. If you want to own it, you'll have to borrow the money. And indeed, even with people who rent, there's often borrowing that's necessary to cover the rent and the food and all the basics of life. That means we burden people with a second problem. Not only do we not give you enough to cover your housing, but we put you in the anxiety of a debt, which is a fixed obligation you have, which is not fair if your income isn't equally fixed. So here we have a disaster. We had that in the years before 2008. And the way we papered over the fact that housing cost more than people's income enabled them to afford was by lending to people. And as the lending went up, we faced an absurd situation. People were borrowing more and more, particularly for housing, because it is one of the biggest expenses anybody has. But their basic income wasn't going up. Well, you don't need a PhD in economics to understand that if your debts are going up, but your underlying income isn't, that's not going to last really long, because you can't service rising debt on an unrising or a non-rising income. And that's what happened in the last 4 months of 2008. Millions of Americans informed whoever they borrowed the money from, the local bank, the local mortgage company, I can't pay my mortgage payment. And at that point, the mortgage market, the place where people come and buy and sell these mortgage obligations, collapsed. And so the government came in, and I want to underscore the irony, particularly for people in a place like Mississippi where this ideology is so strong. The private sector, which enjoys making fun of the government's inefficient, the government is on our back. If only we got rid of the government, if only we freed the private sector. Please enjoy, at least for a moment, the spectacle of September to December of 2008, when all the men, mostly men, a few women, who lead American corporations, finished their speech about how the government is a pain in the neck, got on their private jet, went to Washington, got down on their knees, and begged the government to bail them out. And since they're the ones who put those politicians there, here's the surprise. The government bailed them out. The government bailed them out. You all know that. Here's what the government did. It threw an enormous amount of money at the problem. It changed nothing fundamental in the United States. Not the banking system, not the private enterprise system, not the labor system, nothing. It just threw an enormous amount of money. The result is it didn't change the problem, for example, that people don't earn enough to afford decent housing. That problem has gotten worse in the last 10 years, not better. It made rhetorical, it made lip service. Oh, the banks are too powerful. Well, the banks that were powerful in 2008 are now more powerful than they were then. The banks that were too big to fail in 2008, you're right, they're bigger today than they were then. Nothing fundamental was changed in an economy that's fundamentally broken. Therefore, the next time a crisis came up, like this virus, this was a system that had learned nothing from the last crisis about its fundamental problems, elected Mr. Trump, whose major claim is that the American economy is the greatest in the world and he's the greatest leader in the world, sitting on an economy that was so fragile that when the virus comes here, it collapses. The economy collapses. That's a sign, not that the virus is terrible, which it clearly is, but that this economic system failed to prepare people to safeguard our health, just the way it failed in the housing sector. And therefore, as this crisis hit, this system collapsed. Now to conclude, over the last 2.5 days, the Congress of the United States, Senate and House with the President, have tried late in the game, really late, way too late, to save what will likely be hundreds of thousands of people dying in this country who didn't need to. They got together and here's what they did. They redid what they did in 2008. The only difference is the quantity of money. Because this collapse is so much bigger than the subprime mortgage collapse of 2008, they have to come up with lots more money, which they have done. 2 trillion or whatever exact amount ends up being is significantly more than they threw at the economy 12 years ago when we were in the midst of the crisis of 2008. But they're doing it in much the same way. They're bailing out the banking system. And by the way, the reason the banking system needs it is that literally, virtually every business in the country is deeply in debt. And you might enjoy the reason for it because it tells you about a system that's out of control. One of the ways that the 2008 crash was dealt with by the government was to throw money at the system. And the way they did that was to lower interest rates to nearly zero. Many of you know that. You've noticed that in your own life. Well, what that meant was that every company since 2008, when these things were done, every company in America that has any problem, a problem with its labor force, a problem with bad investments, a problem with managers that screwed up, every problem could be solved by going to the Federal Reserve or your local bank and borrowing virtually costless money. That's why over the last 12 years, the level of debt in the United States has gone crazy. The government is in deeper debt than it has ever been in American history. The corporate sector is in deeper debt than it has ever been in American history. And the mass of people are in deeper debt than they've ever been. Mortgage debt, if you borrowed to buy a house. Automobile debt, if you borrowed to get a car. Credit card debt, if you pay your daily expenses with a credit card. And the really big new one, student debt, in which if you have a kid who wants to go to college, he or she has to drown themselves in levels of debt they know they will never be able to pay. When you put people in these absurd situations, you've got a system that isn't working and that's breaking down. But it means that when the virus hits, it hits corporations that are loaded up with debt. They had to close their doors if they're that kind of business affected that way. Their business is collapsing, and so they cannot repay the banks that they borrowed from. They cannot repay the lenders that they borrowed from. If they're a bank or a bondholder, they're in trouble. And so the banks are falling apart. And once again, as they did 12 years ago, they go to Washington and they say, make money, which they do. Federal Reserve prints as much money as anybody needs. There's no limit, no control. They're creating this money as they need it to bail out the banks. But the federal government, which is separate from the Federal Reserve, they're about to spend $2 trillion. Not a word is spoken because they are afraid of what the people will think. That money that they're spending, that you hear about every day now, that's money the government will have to borrow. It will have to borrow it, which means it's going to go into even more debt than anyone has ever foreseen. What about that? That you'll hear about 6 months from now. They don't want you to worry about that, neither the Republicans nor the Democrats. And remember, when the government borrows, it borrows mostly from rich people and corporations who have the money. That's why most of you that are listening to this, you've never had a conversation with a government agent coming to borrow money from you because you're not in that social class. But if you're very rich or if you're a big corporation, you are in that club. And for those of you that like the politics of this, let me add only that the government after 2008, the US government, borrowing desperately from everyone in the world to pay for the bailout of capitalism #1 in 2008, will now likewise be borrowing from everyone to bail out the corporations now. The largest creditor, the largest lender to the United States government, ready, is the People's Republic of China. That's the largest creditor. The world's largest debtor, the United States. The world's largest creditor, the People's Republic of China. They have lent the United States, depending on how you count, between $1 and $2 trillion. And let me remind you of what the president is afraid to tell you. The Chinese who lent that money to the United States government get interest on that loan, like any other loan, which means every year the United States government must send and does send to the People's Republic of China many tens of billions of dollars in interest. It taxes you and me to raise the money which is collected by Washington and sent to Beijing to help the Chinese government fight the virus, build up their military. You've got to understand this is another sign of the breakdown of a system, that it ends up financing the very country its politicians blame in words while they fund them with money. And why? Well, here's an alternative. How could the United States government raise the money to bail out these corporations without borrowing, say, from China or anybody else? Here's the solution. You tax the rich. Let me give you an example. Jeffrey Bezos, who owns the Amazon Corporation, has $150 billion. That's more money than many countries have. Suppose you said to him, look, Mr. Bezos, we're going to leave you with $1 billion, more than you could ever want for anything. 25 yachts, 50 houses, whatever. The rest of your money, the other 149 billion, we're taking because it's a national emergency, because it's a life or death situation. If you did that to all billionaires, you keep your first billion, but beyond that, we're sorry, we can't have that. You wouldn't have to borrow from the Chinese, and you wouldn't have to tax the American people to pay interest. What's interesting is not that I just came up with an alternative. What's interesting is that you and I live in a society where the politicians responsible will not even discuss what I just said. That has to be kept out of the public discussion. So they're throwing money again. They're changing nothing fundamental. The inequality that was at the base of why people couldn't afford their mortgage payments back in 2008, that inequality, as everyone knows, has gotten worse. So the economy is more divided. You can see that in our politics. You can see the United States is more isolated from the rest of the world than it was before. Here we are needing the help of the Chinese who just had experience with this virus. We don't get any because our government is hostile to that government. Italy is run by very conservative people, but they reached out to the Chinese and they're getting the help that we need. But no, we're going to service our own businesses first. What you see is a dramatic example of the priority that capitalism puts on private profit. And now the price of that is public health. That is a sign of a system that is busted, that has failed. And slowly, and nowadays I take that back, it isn't so slow, quickly, this understanding is seeping into the consciousness. When the archbishops of the Catholic Church tell the president that no, they're not going to pack their churches on Easter, you're seeing a breakdown. When you see even Republican governors who are worried that they can't go against Trump, beginning to go, oh my goodness, I can't be in the position of telling the people in my state to go back to work if it risks their life. I can't do it. I can't reopen the schools. I can't do it. Then you're beginning to see that even the alliance of those at the top is breaking down. When Liberty University, the Falwell institution, announces that they are 100% with the president, they're reopening Liberty University and ordering the students to come back into the dormitories, they're discovering that the families of those students, large numbers of them, are saying, no way are we doing this. We'll find you another school, but we're not going to go along with what increasingly is the isolated, desperate reality. So finally, why? Why is Mr. Trump doing this? And the only answer I can come up with is that he understands, and his advisors have told him, the prospects for being reelected when you have a pandemic of the sort we're living through, and then on top of it, an economic breakdown of the sort we're living to, are somewhere between slim and none at all. He's done. Let's remember, Obama, a Black American, was able to become a president in part because he was the alternative to a George Bush who had presided over the collapse of 2008 and was blamed by the country, and they were willing, even if they had racist, hesitance about voting for a Black man, they knew they had to have change. And remember what Barack said in the beginning, I'm here for hope and change. Okay. Even sleepy Joe Biden will be able to figure out that's his pitch too. So Mr. Trump is desperate. He can't do much about the virus because he waited too long and too late, and he's going to get a lot of blame for that. So he's hoping maybe to squeeze out a victory by having the economic situation come back from the disaster it's in now. And forcing people back to work is the only way he can try to do that. Does that mean he's putting his reelection and the economic
All right, hold tight. He got dropped again. All right, look like he's back. Nope, got dropped again. Hold on, y'all. He's trying.
Okay, are you still there?
We still here. We got you. We were waiting.
Okay, thank you. All right, let me stop. I realize I could just keep going, and I don't want to monopolize the time. I'm sure there are a lot of aspects of this that you have questions about or would like more about or want to argue with me, which is fine. But let me stop and turn it over back to Kali and see, make it go from here in the ways that would be most useful to you.
Well, first, want to thank you for laying that out and struggling through the technological limitations and difficulties. Appreciate that. Don't want to take up time. Let's get into some questions, folks. Everybody, again, please use to make it orderly. Please use the chat feature. Get up the questions. I'll read them off to Rick, so folks can start laying that out. And if you're on your phone, if it's like my phone, I have an iPhone. There's a little thing that says more on the bottom right hand side of the screen. Press that, it opens up and it says chat is underneath either the clap or the thumbs up feature. Hit that, and it'll take you to the chat so you can post your questions. While we're waiting for a couple of questions to come in, can you break down, just as the first question, Rick, a little bit more? Because I think either my system or maybe the overall system kind of got cut off when you were talking about quantitative easing and the Fed just printing, billions and billions of dollars. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes,
and,
sure.
and what they're aiming to do, and then what the consequences might be in terms of either inflation or deflation in the near future, or a little bit of both, depending on what the assets are.
Sure. Let's start with history, because it's always the only way to understand this. Once upon a time in the United States, as with other capitalist countries, we permitted as a society individual banks to print up IOUs, that is, promises to pay, which were then circulated in the economy and used as money. It meant, for example, that a farmer in Kentucky who grew something that he sold, say, in Philadelphia, and had to travel from Kentucky to Philadelphia, would have to travel, get paid in Philadelphia with money produced by a Philadelphia bank, take it back to Kentucky, and then go to the bank and exchange the Philadelphia money for the local money. In other words, we allowed a private system of producing and circulating money undertaken by banks to produce the money we needed to run the economy. There was so much corruption, so much uncertainty. The fellow from Kentucky didn't know what the price in Philadelphia would be. He didn't know when he sold his stuff in Philadelphia for the money from a bank there, how much that money would be worth back in Kentucky when he cashed it in for local Kentucky money. It became an unbearable system. Between the corruption, banks making money out of nothing, just printing it up when there was nothing but to back it up. If people got scared and said, I don't trust this money anymore, and went to the bank and they demanded, I don't want to hold this money you produced, give me something solid like gold, they quickly discovered that the bank had little or no gold. That's where we get the phrase, a run on the bank, because people who suspected that their bank might not have gold to back up their money, literally, the minute they heard that, ran to the bank, because the sooner you got there, the better the chance there'd be any gold left to honor your demand. If you got there a minute too late, the bank teller would shut the window and you'd be holding pieces of paper that were not worth anything. To stop all of that craziness, country after country decided that the only way to run a system was to give the government, they couldn't think of anybody else they could trust, give the government the exclusive right to print and circulate money. Basically, that's when all the central banks, like the Bank of England, the Bank of France, that's when they began having that function. It's part of the development of capitalism. They do share it with private banks. You all know that if you go to a private bank, you give them some money to start an account, a checking account. They are free to take most of that money and lend it out. They give you little or nothing for it. They lend it out at a nice rate of return. That's how they make their money. But they then give you a checking account which you can use as money. There's a bit of a creation of money there as well. But the core of the system is the government. In this country, we had a Bank of the United States, but it got caught up in political squabbles early in the 19th century. We tried again to go with private money. That didn't work. So in 1913, a little over 100 years ago, we created a central bank for the United States. But because of that history, we didn't call it the Bank of the United States. We called it the Federal Reserve System. And that's been our central bank since. And so here's the key economic reality to understand. The Federal Reserve divides the United States into 12 regions. They're called Federal Reserve regions. There's one, and each of them has a central city where a branch of the Federal Reserve called the Federal Reserve Bank is located. There's one in Atlanta, there's one in New York, Chicago, LA. You can imagine the 12 major cities in this country. And the Federal Reserve, the head of each bank, that's 12 banks, sit on a board in Washington called the Federal Reserve Board. And they have a president named by the President of the United States. Trump named a man named Jerome Powell. He's the head of it. The job of the Federal Reserve is to manage the monetary system of the United States. What does that mean? Basically two things, maybe three. Number one, to control the amount of money in circulation. Literally, they can increase the amount of money in the economy or they can decrease it. In the old days, when money was mostly paper and coins, this meant that the Federal Reserve decided how much paper and how many nickels, pennies, and quarters there were in circulation. When they decided there was more money in the economy than they felt there ought to be, they pulled it out. They took the dollar bills and the $20 bills and they burnt them with fire. They melted the coins down or used them for something else. When they wanted the economy to have more money, they called up the mint and they said, roll the presses, circulate, we need, 10 billion more or whatever it is. Number two, how did they insert the money into the economy? Answer, they lend it to banks. They say to the banks, here, we've got some fresh new money. If you'd like to borrow it, we'll lend it to you. And here's the interest rate we'll charge, which gets me to the third thing the Federal Reserve does. It determines the interest rates. It does that if it wants the banks to, if they want there to be more money in the economy, they lower the interest rate. And what that does is make it more attractive for banks around the country to borrow fresh new money from the Federal Reserve. If they think there's too much money in the economy, they raise the interest rate, because what that does is it discourages banks from borrowing. Meanwhile, the banks have to repay the borrowings they did earlier, and as they do that, the Federal Reserve takes that money and burns it, and in that way reduces the amount of money in circulation. Every time the economy gets crazy, which capitalism is a highly unstable system. You must remember, capitalism is roughly 300 years old. It started in England back in the 18th or 17th centuries and has spread over the world in the 3 centuries since that time. Wherever capitalism has existed, throughout that time, on average, every 4 to 7 years, there's an economic downturn. As I like to say to my students, if you lived with a person as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. But we live with a system that every 4 to 7 years, on average, tanks. It throws millions of people out of work. It collapses all kinds of businesses. It bankrupts cities and towns, all the rest of it. Crazy system. How we ever allowed ourselves to become subject to it remains one of the great mysteries of the human condition. But in any case, that's what we have. That's why most economists knew we were due for an economic collapse. If it wasn't the virus, it would have been something else, because the last downturn in this country was in 2008 and 9, and you can do the math. 4 to 7 years is the average. We're already overdue for one by 2 or 3 years, and therefore it was already looming. Much of what Mr. Donald Trump, as president, has done in the last 2 or 3 years is everything he can think of to postpone the downturn so it would happen after November of 2020. He could hope to keep the economy from collapsing because it was his ticket to re-election, he thought. His worst nightmare, which he himself is largely responsible for, is this pandemic, or to be more precise, to the failure of the economy to prepare for, to handle, to manage this virus in a way that wouldn't threaten his re-election. But the history of the world doesn't work the way the leaders want it to, and most of the time, that's good news for the rest of us. In any case, the Federal Reserve uses its power to control the money system when the economy has a really bad downturn. Not one that's short and shallow, but one that's long and deep, like the one in 2008, and indeed like the one back in the 1930s, which still is the worst of capitalism's downturns, although the one we're in now is a leading contender to surpass that. What the Federal Reserve always does in these things is to use its two basic powers: money control, interest rates. And what it does is flood the economy with money. The Federal Reserve has already been doing that for the last year and a half because Trump put enormous pressure. He hopes to keep the collapse until after he's reelected. So they've been doing that. And they've also been doing the other, dropping interest rates to ridiculously low money. The reason the interest rates are really low is because the banks can basically borrow any amount of money from the Federal Reserve at ridiculously low rates, rates that are in the neighborhood of the last many years of 2, 1.5, 1, half of 1%, historically very low. So that's what they've been doing. That's what they continue to do because that's the way the system is set up. It is therefore, let me stop with this, it's therefore quite easy for economists like me and others to point out that's not going to solve the problem, because our economy has collapsed because people are not going to kill themselves to go to work. And you can throw as much money as you want. You can't get people, at least you can't get huge numbers of them, to take a risk like Russian roulette of their own demise, of their own death. They're not going to do it, and you better come up with other ways of coping, because this situation isn't going to get solved by this kind of money flooding of the system. Last point. If you flood the system with money, what has happened, and that's been going on, as I say, since 2008. Everybody worried. Everybody who understands these things worried. Just as Kali's question just worried. This money could lead to an inflation. All that extra money running after goods and services would lead to a bidding up of their prices. And that's perfectly correct. But here's what happened. All that extra money didn't go into the regular economy. Wages didn't go up. They didn't go into producing anything. Why? Because companies in the United States have been cutting back on their economic growth because the mass of people's incomes is going nowhere. Real wages in America haven't changed for 30 to 40 years. The people in America, therefore, borrowed money. Okay, they're now borrowed up to their necks. They can't borrow the way they once did back in the 80s and 90s. So there's no incentive for corporations to take the money and expand production, hire more people, to produce goods and services. So they didn't. So where did all the money go? Into the stock market. The banks, the wealthy, the corporations became busy buyers of shares. Much of the bailout of American corporations in 2008 was used by those corporations to go into the stock market and buy up their own shares. Why? It's called, by the way, stock buyback. Why do they do that? Because if the company goes into the market to buy up the shares, it bids up the price of the shares. And why would they do that? Because the salaries of the top executives are usually linked to the share price. So those executives directed the bailout money to build up the share prices and thereby got themselves the spectacular incomes we've all read about. Is that a reasonable thing to do? Well, for them it was. For the rest of us, no. But that's not the way this system works. We have had the inflation Kali is worried about, but it's been limited to the stock market. Over the last 12 years, the stock market went crazy because all of that money went into buying a share of stock, offering to pay more because you were reasonably confident as a banker, as a big corporation, that everybody else was doing that. So you could buy the share and sell it 6 months from now at a higher price to somebody who believed that that would continue. And so the system went up and up and up. So the stock market was doing great, which is why Donald Trump kept talking about it, because it was the part of the economy he could talk about positively. Meanwhile, the production in this country went nowhere. More and more goods come from outside because the rest of the world has a productive system. The United States is losing its. And so you have this hollowing out of the economy, and it's all based on money. And if something happens to prevent the companies whose stock has gone crazy from making the profit they used to make, it will collapse like a house of cards. And that's what we've seen in the last 2 weeks. Suddenly, the pandemic means we can't have workers going to work. We can't have people going to the store to buy this stuff. The corporation's profit are going into the toilet. And suddenly everybody who owns share in that company wants to sell it. And so the stock market collapsed over the last 2 weeks, which anyone who's ever studied this stuff could have and did say to you in advance. More signs the system is broken.
All right, we got a couple of questions, Rick. The first one is from Amy. How do we control misinformation in a pandemic without taking control of all media outlets? Then we got a couple more questions after that. That's the first one.
Amy's question is super, but Amy's question knows its own answer. Right?
Yep.
You know, Amy, because of the way you phrased the question, and I agree with you 100%, but the way you phrased the question is correct. You don't. We now see what it means to have so much of our media in the hands of so few people, and that those people are the heads of huge corporations who have done well despite the collapse in 2008, who continue now to be able to organize the same bailout that enriched them in 2008. They hope and expect will do it for them again. And if along the way, a million Americans die who didn't need to, they seem, I know this is horrible, but what else can I say? They seem to be okay with that price being paid, even when the virus, goes up high in the society. I read this morning that the Prime Minister of England, Boris Johnson, has now been tested positive for the virus. All right. These sorts
Sorry
of
for laughing.
Yeah, no, I know, but there is a certain grim laughter that the craziness of this system not only condemns the mass of people, but in this situation, really, it's the ultimate breakdown of a system. It's literally destroying even the people at the top. But to get to Amy's question, yes, we have to find reliable, independent sources of information. And unless people step up and do it, using social media, using even a conference call of this sort that we're doing right now, this is the only way to get the communications going as an alternative. But we should see it. You're quite right. We should see it as a job we have. We have to set up the institutions, the mechanisms, the technology, so that we can communicate. And things are going very, very fast. If large numbers of people are told to go to work, I cannot stress this enough, on April 10th or whenever the date is, and they don't do it, that's a general strike. Whether you call it that or not, whether the press recognizes it that way or not, that's what a general strike has been in the history of capitalism. It's when large numbers of workers, not necessarily all of them or anything like it, large numbers of workers say, okay, we are not going to do business as usual because business as usual in this capitalist system is unacceptable. And just one last point about that. Back in December, the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, decided that the difficulties of capitalism in Europe, which are severe, they're somewhat different than the United States, but they are severe. Capitalism is in trouble everywhere in the world, not just here. But Mr. Macron decided that one way to fix capitalism, which should come as no surprise to you, was to reduce the pensions that the French people have. French workers have much better pensions than Americans. They've had better pensions for decades. If you didn't know that, well, that goes to Amy's question. We don't have the kind of information to tell you that. My family is French, so I know personally exactly how generous French pensions are. Like Americans, if you're a French worker, you pay into the pension system during your working life, and then you can retire, by the way, at age 62, not age 65, age 62, and you can get a very, very good pension, and certainly by American standards. Okay, he wants to cut them. Of course, he doesn't say that, so he talks all about a pension reform. French workers are very well organized. They have about as much confidence in their president, Macron, as you and I do if someone hands us a $4 bill. Okay, so they know. So guess what they did? They had a general strike. So don't think it's weird or strange or not the time to do it. From January to right through, from December, excuse me, both the Christmas holiday and the New Year's holiday, Paris, the capital city of France, was effectively closed. The trains didn't run, the buses didn't go, large numbers of workers refused to work. You had a general strike. Guess what? The pension reform was withdrawn. Now he's going to try it again, and he may get it, who knows? But the workers informed him, and they kept it going for a month or so, a general strike that really showed the capacity of the workers to shut that economy down. And they have threatened to resume the general strike if he continues to push for this reform, which they will not accept. It's the perfect analogy to what is building in this country around the pandemic.
All right. The next question. This is from Kwame and Abriani. Has there been any presence of the government mandating the rich to engage in aiding the economy?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I could say it again, but I'm sure you understood me. Nothing. I mean, it is so gross that it puts people like me, because I read a lot of the foreign press. I have to keep up with this stuff. When the catastrophe here in the United States, which is still going on, that we don't have the test kits that would allow there to be the testing in America that would give the government even a sense of where the disease is the worst. I mean, to give you an example, right now everybody says it's in New York. Yeah, that's because we have done a good bit of testing here. We don't know, though, whether if we tested in God knows what other parts of the United States, we might find a level of disease that is greater or lesser. We can't do even any kind of rational planning, late as we are, because we don't have the kits. Well, about 10 days ago, one of the richest people in China, Jack Ma, who's the head of the Chinese competitor to Google in this country, basically said he was going to contribute, I don't know, $20 million or some large sum of money to buy test kits and contribute them to the United States. A Chinese businessman is contributing to the United States. By comparison, the richest Americans, and I'm talking about people who talk like they care, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Jeffrey Bezos, other multi-billionaires, silence. They don't even bother to do, the PR thing of saying, okay, I'm going to do this. The workers at Amazon, for example, are enraged that Amazon will not give you more than 2 weeks paid leave if you have the virus. What? Their focus on profit is such they don't want to give you. And they give a suggestion to other workers who aren't infected. If you want, we will let you contribute your sick leave days that you've got coming to those to whom we don't give more than 2 weeks. I mean, it takes your breath away. That's what I mean. A government so far gone that it can't anymore comprehend. There's a joke about the aristocracy in France in the days before the French Revolution of 1789. The queen at the time, who became famous for this, was named Marie Antoinette. And as she looked down from the glorious palace of Louis the whoever number she had married, she could hear the mass of the French people demanding bread and complaining that the price of bread was too high. People were starving. She couldn't understand. So she uttered the famous line, well, if the price of bread is too high, let them eat cake. Her suggestion was that people who couldn't afford bread should buy cake. It became an example of a government that is so far out of touch with the reality of the mass of people that they could so badly misunderstand the complaint about bread as though it meant they didn't like the price of bread. And so she had a great idea. Why don't you switch to cake for a while? I mean, it blows the mind. I don't mean to scare anyone, but where Marie finally ended up was having those same mass of people whom she had disrespected separate the lower part of her body from her head with something called the guillotine.
The next question, also from Abriani and Kwame. In what ways do you think cooperative enterprises can counteract the stronghold of the elite has on the economy and subsequently the ability to implement and reform law and policy?
Well, here's the answer, and I hope it doesn't appear to you to be far-fetched, because let me tell you, we have tried, and I mean by we, the broadly defined progressive, left, whatever you want to call it. We have agreed, starting back almost a century ago in the Great Depression, we've agreed to reforms. What I mean is we've agreed to change the system in modest ways, to establish unemployment insurance or the Banking Act or the Social Security system. We've been told by those reformers that they don't need a revolution, that we can fix the system this way and that, and then we can be in better shape. We don't need the scary trauma of a revolution. They've told us that for 100 years. And we went along with it. I mean, not everyone, but most, we went along. And we saw reforms even get enacted. Social Security, we got it. Unemployment compensation, we got it. A minimum wage, we got it, although it has been eroded into nothing. A government employment program back in the 30s, we got it. But here's what we also know. As soon as those things are won over the opposition of the employer class, they go to work to evade those reforms, to weaken those reforms, and eventually to overturn those reforms. That's why the minimum wage, if you adjust it for prices, is worth less today than it was when it got passed in the 1930s in terms of what a minimum wage earner can afford to buy. So it seems to me that reforms have had their chance, have been the solution that we and others have supported. But we now know that reforms aren't enough because they leave in place the people who own and operate industry, and they gather into their hands the profits, and they use those profits to undo whatever reforms we won and to block us from any more reforms. So in response to people telling me, well, let's do this reform or that reform, my answer is, I've been there, I've done that, it doesn't work. So now my answer to the question, yeah, I'm an advocate of workers owning and operating their own enterprises collectively and democratically. And the reason is simple. As long as we allow a tiny minority of people, and let's remember, the employers, whether they are big businesses or medium businesses or little businesses, the employers altogether are a small minority of the United States. And employees are the vast majority. If you have an economic system, whatever you call it, that allows a small minority to control, own, and operate the businesses that produce the goods and services without which we cannot live, food, clothing, shelter, all of it. If you allow a tiny minority to own and operate and control them, you really cannot be surprised if they use that position to enhance, to support, and to primarily serve themselves. That's what got us into the crash of 2008. That's what undermined the preparedness for this pandemic that should have occurred. And that's what's determining the ineffective, too little, too late, unfair throwing of money at the problem again now. So yes, I advocate what? Simple idea. Make the enterprises something owned and operated by the employees, the majority, because that way, both the decisions made in each enterprise and the decisions imposed on the government, if it's to be a government under the control of the people, will come from the majority, from the employees, and not from a special interest minority, the employers. And for me, that is the big change. Want to call it revolutionary? Fine. I don't really care. We've tried over and over again to reform the capitalist system. And we've seen either obstruction of those reforms or undoing them after we've struggled and won them. And the reason is because we allow a small group of people to make all the decisions. They've had their chance. They've had it for 200 to 300 years across the world. And it seems to me obvious. We can do better than that system, and we should have, and we've now learned the lesson. And that's why you folks in Jackson and elsewhere that are trying to develop a cooperative economic system, you are the vanguard. I mean, there's no other way to put it. You are the model, and we are all hoping that you and the other examples, because people are trying it elsewhere too, that you can be supported, you can be building up, because you will be not only a model, but you'll be the political base for new political parties that emerge that are advocates for this alternative and against the Republicans and Democrats, because whatever they tell you, they are advocates, and most of them will say this, by the way, they are advocates for capitalism. That's what they are. I don't know if any of you saw that a few years ago, Nancy Pelosi, the head of the Congressional Democrats, being asked a question by a young man about socialism, looking kind of puzzled at him and saying, I really don't know what you're talking about. We're all capitalists now. Okay, I understand. She's right. I agree with her. But what the country needs is a advocacy for something different, and forming worker co-ops is not only going in a new direction, more able and more likely to succeed, but it's also the base for a new politics. Just like the capitalists have their political parties, Republican and Democrat, a worker co-op based economic sector will have to generate its own political expressions, and that will make this country more diverse, more healthy, and we'll finally get the discussion about what the system is we want that works best for most of us, rather than having a system controlled by a minority that puts us in a position of having to argue for something that should have been in place a long time ago.
Right on. Right on. Couple of more before we got about 20 minutes before we shut it down for the day. Anyway, want to definitely have you back to deal with some of this the next couple of weeks, Rick, with us. But the next question is from Sabrina. She says, I've noticed that banks have developed or placed limits on the cash withdrawals. Is this just to control physical cash or physical customers or something else?
No, I think what you're beginning to see is an attempt by a chaotic government. It was chaotic before, as we know. It has become much more chaotic because they know much better than the public the scale of the breakdown that we're facing and the risks we're facing. So they are, on the one hand, trying to hold on to their popularity. Let me explain. You're now seeing corporate America reeling. The value of their stocks have collapsed. Their ability to control their workers is severely limited. Their customer base is severely limited. They're competing with Europe now, and Europe is going its own way. The alliance they once counted on, it's not there. Their worst nightmare, China, has gotten through this pandemic, and here in the United States, it's barely beginning. That's a very scary proposition. They understand the risks. To call on the people to pack the churches in 2 weeks and to face again the opposition of something as powerful as the leadership of the Roman Catholic Church is a sign of a society falling apart. Corporate America sees it and knows it. The question is what to do. My guess is, I don't know this, I'm not claiming I know it, I don't. But my guess is you're having intense conversations among corporate leaders in America about whether it's time for Mr. Trump to go. That's how serious it is. And I don't mean go in November. I mean go in whatever forms are necessary. So I can't underscore more intensely how severe this crisis is. They follow every statistic. They're trying to control it. Try to think of it in the metaphor of a dam. There's a village that lives below a dam, and the dam is beginning to crack. And so the people desperately run in every direction, trying to put, supports for the dam so that it doesn't crack here or a hole doesn't develop over there. That's what you have, a kind of disorganized government. And it's disorganized not just because of Trump and that, but because of the whole history of our society. We have a weak government in many ways, and managing society, they never wanted the government to be strong because it would compete with private enterprise. That's why the government has been kept in the kind of limbo it has. And when the government is strong, that's what it has to be, particularly subordinate to the private sector. In any case, they're looking to control the situation. For example, they're fearful that Americans will begin to wonder, as by the way they should, are the things I thought were safe actually safe? There's no way to stop this. Let me give you an example. I thought if I get sick, I can call my doctor. Well, you can't. Give you an example. A friend of mine had a problem with his skin. He called his dermatologist. The dermatologist's office is closed until the end of April because the dermatologist is afraid to be in there seeing patients. And his workers won't come. All right, if you're learning to be afraid that minor health problems you have can't be seen, and for those who are poor and who, when they have an emergency, go to the emergency room in the nearby hospital, you'd have to be crazy to do that. If you sit in that emergency room, you're surrounded by people who may, and probably in some cases, do have the virus. It's the worst place for you to go. So where the hell are you going to go? You can't afford a doc. I mean, you know the story. Okay, so now the next question is, and I don't mean to frighten you, but you asked the question. Here's a question. Is the money you have in the bank safe? Is it really there to help you? Or will something happen? All kinds of things you never imagined are now happening. What about that one? So they're beginning to draft rules and regulations, and I'm not surprised, to begin to control that. Just like, you know, when you put you block a hole in the dam over there, you notice a dribble beginning to happen, you know, 10 feet away. You kind of begin to, whoa, I better get more general solution here. At least more people with mud to put up to hold back the water. That's what you're getting here now. When I told you earlier that the EPA today relaxed the rules on emitting dangerous pollutants into the air, what the hell are you doing? The oil and gas companies are squealing. The problem for oil and gas in the world now is, as everything shuts down, we don't need the oil and gas we used to because the factories aren't working. And the oil and gas companies are having trouble. They can't survive. But why is that a danger? Because oil and gas in the United States is one of the biggest borrowers of money from the bank. If they can't sell oil and gas, they can't repay the bank. Well, if they can't repay the bank, what's the bank going to do? And now the worry becomes, uh-oh, will they grab my money? Will they tell me they can't give me my money? Okay, well, maybe they'll say, you just have to wait a week. Yeah, but I might need it this week. And maybe 1 week becomes 3 weeks, and maybe 3 weeks becomes 3. I better get my money out now. That has happened in history over and over again. And Americans are having to learn, painful as it is, that what you thought only happens elsewhere, no, it can happen here too, and that's what's happening now. And it is, don't be ashamed of being frightened. You should be. If you're frightened, it's because you're paying attention. If you're not frightened, it's because you are really out of it. Like those kids on spring break in Florida, cavorting on the beach and giving each other life-threatening illnesses because they haven't been able to get their heads around how serious this is.
All right. 2 more questions for today, and we'll stop at like 12 sharp, y'all. So here's one. How could a solidarity economy quantify the value or service as a good service or service as a Kwame, I don't think I fully understand your question as you wrote it. How could a solidarity economy quantify the value or service as a goods juxtaposed to how? Oh, okay. It's if I understand what you're saying, go ahead, Kwame, ask it.
I've worded it wrong. You mind if I just kind of vocalize this one?
Shoot.
Okay, yeah. So my question is, how could a solidarity economy, to a certain degree, quantify the exchange of goods and services, as opposed to how the capitalist structure does it? Meaning, like, how do we place values? Like, say if we completely alleviate the idea of exchanging money for our goods and services, what kind of system do we have to put in place to establish an equal value of what we're exchanging for services? Like, say if I had a bunch of cantaloupes and my neighbor over here had a bunch of watermelons, but I feel like my cantaloupes are a little bit more valuable than his watermelons. Like, what kind of system could we possibly put in place to help reprimand that so things don't get chaotic? Like, how could that kind of thing?
Yeah, no,
counter it?
your question is perfectly good. You know, and it was the same question that was asked by people at the beginning of capitalism. You know, again, the history is so helpful here. For most of the history of the human race, there weren't such things as prices, and there weren't such things as money. That's not how people did it. They didn't work things out that way. And you know, you all know that, even if it isn't ready in your head. Let me give you an example. You're home for Thanksgiving dinner. And, you know, Thanksgiving dinner is a complicated thing. Somebody has to prepare the sweet potatoes, and somebody has to set the table, and somebody has to cook the turkey if you have turkey, blah, 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 all the different things. And all the members of your family or your neighborhood or your friend, whoever you gather for Thanksgiving, you kind of want to help. Everybody wants to do something. And you work things out. Mary, you make the potatoes. John, you set the table. And Francis, you know, you work. And you do that for all family get-togethers and for all family holidays. And there's an understanding in the community that everybody is to do his or her part. You're not just to show up, sit down, and eat while everybody else did the work. That won't work. Might work once, but someone's going to take you aside and say, you know, don't do that. People are going to resent it, and you're going to suffer for it. It's not fair, and it's not appropriate. Well, in the history of economics, this has been thought through. What happens if a society changes from working things out as a group? You do this work, I do that work. Then we share the output. If you're the guy who makes all the bread, and you're the person who cooks, and you're the person who sews the clothing, we're going to have to work things out, because you need clothing even though you're the baker, and you need bread even though you're the shirt maker. And we're going to have to move stuff around so kind of everybody does a job and everybody gets the benefits of everybody doing a job. Human societies worked that out for centuries without money and without bargaining. I'll give you 3 of these for 2 of that. None of that. Okay, but then society changed and we had a new way. We didn't work it out in a family. We didn't work it out in a tribe or a clan or some kind of community with rules that were developed about how each of us participates and shares what we produce. Instead, we said, we're going to do it differently. We're all going to gather at a certain place on a certain day, each of us producing whatever the hell we want, and we arrive at that place and that day and that time, and we sit there and we say, I got this stuff I did, the cantaloupes in your example, or the shirts or the pots and pans, and I'm willing to exchange them because I can't eat pots and pans. I made pots and pans, but I'm interested in getting some tomatoes and some potatoes and some bread. And I tell you what, I'll give you this amount of pot if you give me that pots, and you give me that amount of, and we bargain and we set up a ratio that's called a price. I'm going to give you so much of this for so much of that. And after a while, we insert money. So I'll give you so many pots, you give me X dollars, and then I'll use the dollars to buy the tomatoes at whatever price. And we work it out by bargaining. And then along come the economists and say, yeah, you can do it that way. But in the end, there has to be a kind of social agreement. You can't have that go, for example, that the person who makes the tomatoes says, I'm not giving anybody a tomato unless I get everything you produce. You got to give me all your pots or I won't give you a single tomato. But a person who does that is saying, I'm not playing by the rules that are the unspoken rules of the game. And what will happen to a person like that is everybody will say, okay, we're not going to deal with you anymore. We're going to ask John over there, another person, to start growing tomatoes. And he's going to grow them. We're going to all buy them from him because he's going to charge us a reasonable amount and you're unreasonable. And that's the way that rules are going to be enforced. And then economists ask themselves, what is the unspoken rule? that lies behind it. Here comes the answer, which is also the answer to your question. It got codified later, but it was originally called the labor theory of value. And it goes like this. And by the way, the first person to articulate it, Adam Smith, often referred to as the father of modern economics and capitalism. Adam Smith, here's his line from his most important book, The Wealth of Nations. The value of anything produced is determined in the last analysis. It's determined, and here come his words, the toil and trouble needed to produce it. So you can have prices gyrating. You can have this strange person saying, you got to give me $1 million for my tomato. But in the end, societies organize things so that what it took 2 hours for John to produce will be exchanged pretty much for whatever Mary can do in 2 hours. Because if it isn't, then we're going to see John do what Mary was doing, or Mary do what John was doing, if you don't get it organized that way. My guess is if we had an economic system based on worker co-ops, you'd begin to see a system of exchanging among the worker co-ops based on the amount of work that went into what worker co-op number one is willing to give up. It's more or less what the amount of work goes into what worker co-op number two is going to give in exchange. The labor, that's the thing that's scarce. We can produce more. We know how to use the wealth of nature and the earth. What's always scarce is the amount of time and energy our community of people is willing to put into producing goods and services. Because we have other things people are doing. They're raising children, they're tending to the elderly, they're performing music. But whatever part of the community we have left that's devoted to producing goods and services, the basic idea is divide them up among the different tasks, group them in worker co-ops so that the decisions are made democratically, and then distribute amongst us roughly according to the one really scarce thing, the toil and trouble, to quote Adam Smith, that it takes to produce stuff. And by the way, economies in trouble have done that. Even the United States, and I hate to take the time, but it'll help you. In World War II, the United States was scared, this time not by a virus, but by the risk that Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy and Tojo in Japan would be able to defeat the United States in World War II. And so the United States, kind of late in the game again, decided all-out war to fight against fascism roughly from 1941 to 1945. Why is it relevant? Well, because of the following. In order to fight the war, huge portion of the resources of America went to the war effort. Railroads had to move things around to produce airplanes and guns and bullets and all the other things of war. And as a result, the resources left to produce goods and services were very scarce. Now, the number of Americans who needed goods and services hadn't changed. We were all there. The war was not fought on the United States. It was fought elsewhere, with the exception of Pearl Harbor. So we had millions of all the American people who wanted to buy clothes and eat food and have their housing in order and all the rest, drive their cars. But the resources devoted to producing for them had been drastically cut. So we knew, here comes the punchline, we knew that consumer goods would be in scarce supply, but the Americans who needed them were as numerous as ever. That meant if we allowed the capitalist market price system to work, we'd see an inflation that would be incredible. Rich people would have the money to go and get those scarce things by bidding up the price. Suppose there was a rich person who had cats. He would go to the store and buy up the milk to feed his cats. Whereas a middle income or poor person who had children couldn't afford the price that a rich person offered for the scarce milk. His kids would have to go hungry while the rich person's cats had a jolly good time. Okay, the government understood, the US government, that if you did that, the anger, the bitterness, and the rage of the American people, the mass of the people, against the rich would produce domestic chaos, division in our society, when what you need in a war is unity. So what the government did, recognizing in that moment of crisis that a market system was horribly antisocial, dangerous, they abrogated the market. They ended the market. The government said, anyone who buys a quart of milk or a gallon of gas for their car or a pound of meat or a pound of coffee or any of the basics had to do it with a ration card issued by the government. Money could not be used. Any storekeeper who sold stuff for money without a ration card would be arrested for violating the law. How were ration cards produced? The government printed them. How were they distributed to the population? Some of you will enjoy this. They were distributed according to need. If you had a lot of children, you got more ration cards for milk. If you didn't have any children, you didn't get those ration cards for milk. We didn't allow prices to be determining anything. The market was banished because we needed it for a national emergency, in that case, a war. And we worked out how to distribute income and money from the people who bought things, who paid with money if they had it, with a ration card if they didn't, and the government came in and reorganized all of this. So we actually have experience which could be brought to bear on how to arrange for distribution of products and resources among worker co-ops without needing to resort to the market and the price system that will pass just like the rest of capitalism. Remember, every system like capitalism was born, and I'm including slavery, feudalism, ancient tribal society, you name it. Every system we know of was born, over time it evolved, and then it died, just like all of us. And capitalism, there's no reason to believe, is an exception. We know it was born, we know it's evolved, and while it may be depressing, the next stage for capitalism is passing away for something else. And all I'm telling you is that we may be a lot closer to that moment than any of us thought as little as 3 weeks ago.
All right, Rick, you got maybe 10 more minutes?
Sure.
Folks can hang in there. We've got 2 questions just want to make sure we get to.
Okay.
One is from Abriani and one is from Katie. Abriani wants to know what are people to do who are not part of a democratically run cooperative, as well as don't own their own home. And then from Katie, do you believe, which you partly just answered, do you believe in an eventual emergence of another moneyless system, a resource-based economy, etc.? And we'll end with those 2, y'all.
Well, to answer the second one first, yes, I think they're desperately trying to hold on. I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can, which is to say I can't. So is it possible that they'll pull it out of the fire again? Yes, it is possible. They may. They did it in 2008. I couldn't quite believe they pulled it off. The American people accepted bailing out the rich and providing austerity to the rest of us. The American people accepted a growing inequality. And I may, and you and I may all be witnessing yet another acceptance by the mass of the American people of the failure to cope with this pandemic, of the failure to prepare for it, all of it. That's possible. I don't know. But I can tell you that the level of breakdown is now far and away the greatest I have seen in my lifetime. And I know that the people at the top are not equipped, neither intellectually nor in terms of their experience, to manage it. They are flying by the seat of their pants. They're winging it, whatever words you like. They don't know what to do because they've never seen it either. And They'll throw things together, but yeah, one of them will be to abrogate the market, to abrogate price. They don't want to do that. They believe in all of that. They are economic fundamentalists. They really believe that the private sector has some magic that's going to save us all. But that is getting in the way of making decisions that are being forced on them by a flow of events they cannot control. So yes, the short answer, all kinds of things are possible now because all the rules are gone, all the norms are finished, and it's a very strange time in the society. Can you remind me of the first question? Because I want to just very briefly get to it.
I think it's some kind of practical. Brianna is wondering, you know,
Yes.
for folks who aren't in worker co-ops, which is the vast majority of working people right now, unfortunately, and folks who don't own their homes, you know, in terms of what they can do in the here and now, what should be advocating folks to do.
Okay, let's start with the renters. Much of the society is divided in this country between renters and homeowners. In general, there are exceptions, but in general, wealthier people are homeowners and less wealthy people are renters. There are exceptions, but in general. And the legislation so far contemplated and passed tilts way more towards the mortgage owners, that is the people who at least on paper own their home, than the renters. And so one of the first things the renters need to do is mobilize, organize to make sure that renters are given every possible assistance here. If you've lost your job through no fault of your own, you can't pay your rent. And this system has to accommodate that. It's accommodating, I mean, in the legislation that is going through Congress, they're about to give $17 billion to the Boeing Corporation. The Boeing Corporation has been convicted and has admitted to shortchanging the safety that killed 300 people over the last couple of years in major air crashes. They're going to help that company because it's suffering from the virus. I mean, put aside the immorality of that. But if they're in the business, which they say they are, of helping people suffering in the virus, people are having impossible demands put on them, and there has to be a moratorium, not just on mortgage payments, but on rent payments. And I think you could organize people who are renters to mobilize, to get into groups, to pressure the local legal authorities and the media to give relief to renters. Landlords have to share the burden everybody else is under, and they have to forego their income as rent receivers, just the way workers that have been fired from their job in the airport or in the restaurant or in the travel agency or anywhere else have been put in an impossible situation. It can't be the roll of the dice in a society that pretends to be fair. And I think you would have a mobilization of rent people who could, in protest around this one issue, which is as clear as day, maybe also get to the notion that there ought to be rent controls across the United States, limits on what can be charged, not allowing landlords in places where a lot of people want to move to just raise the rent no matter what it is, driving everybody who can't afford it out. The plague of what is called gentrification is the same issue. But here you have an immediate issue that people who are renters can mobilize around at a time when the audience for that is going to be exploding in the weeks ahead. On the other one, it had to do with if you're not working in a worker co-op. I think there the best thing you can do is to get your fellow workers to understand that being in the position of waiting for the axe to fall, being in a place where you don't know what the employer is going to do. You don't know whether the job you have now, you'll have it next week. Whether the pay you get now will be there next month. Whether the job you're being asked to do will check. You have no control over anything in your life. It's an unbearable level of uncertainty to impose on people. And it wouldn't be there if you had the kind of participation of the employees in making the basic decisions that a worker co-op is. It's not that you would get through this crisis without some hurt. You would, but it'd be a lot less hurt because you wouldn't be excluded from the decision-making, on the understanding of what's happening to the enterprise. If you're an employee, you're being treated like a child. And you're not a child, you're an adult. You should be part of the struggle of how best to solve the problems. You're going to be asked to make all kinds of sacrifices, but you're not being allowed to participate in deciding who makes what sacrifices. That is an outrageous abrogation of your rights as a citizen of what calls itself a democratic society. And I would urge you to make that argument, to make this a moment that is bad in so many ways, but is good. It's like a teaching moment. It's a moment when people will understand things that in other times and circumstances, they would have been unable or unwilling to consider. And you who see it can be the agent of an enormous change of consciousness, which this situation needs as bad as it needs everything else.
All right. This was, I think, great. Hopefully, the technology limited some of what we wanted to do, but we suffered through it, made it through it. Hopefully, we all got a lot that we've learned from it, and we could apply. We're going to record this, send it out more to our broad membership of folks who couldn't be here. Rick, I want to thank you and Alan for helping us put this together. We definitely want to continue doing more of this. Again, I'll throw out to you and Alan, we are going to be working as diligent we can to try to, pull together some type of coordinated work stoppage, potentially general strike action. Rick, we hope we could get you on to both, help us to continue to do some demand development and spread the call if and when it goes out, in the next couple of days. Many of these are already emerging, so just trying to pull some things together, hoping that we can forge some kind of unity and some long-term, structural-oriented demands with it, to kind of seize the time for working people. But we'll continue, stop there. Thank everybody for participating. We all got a tremendous amount of work to do, so let's get to it. Rick and Alan will be in contact again soon.
Thank you, Kali.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, all of you, for spending your time doing this. This kind of working together and thinking these things through together, that's a really valuable part of all of this, and I'm proud to be part of it.
Thank you again. We're looking forward to more. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Who's that?
I don't know.
That was good. Good work, Allie.
Look at me on Zoom.